Public Policy Studies is a group of conservatives and libertarians dedicated to reforming the current legal order. We're committed to the principles that state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the providence and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. Today we have with us Professor Josh Blackman from the South Texas School of Law. Josh is the author of the critically acclaimed Unprecedented, the Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare. He was selected by Forbes magazine for the 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy. He's the founder and president of the Harlan Institute, the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, and blogs at joshblackman.com. Without further ado, here's Josh.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to the IU chapter for having me in. I appreciate the warm invitation. I'm glad some of you brave the trick-or-treating to come talk about this. So my goal for today is to discuss executive power, but in a slightly different spin. I want to explain executive power to you in the context of a few contemporary issues: immigration, Obamacare, and foreign relations, which is going to be basically Libya and ISIS. And I want to explore how the president's executive powers shift when there's gridlock in Washington. In other words, how do we understand the scope of the president's powers when Congress won't give him the authority he needs? Okay. So we often think, oh, I think it's not going to work. So two of these, right? Okay. We often think of gridlock as something very bad, as something that needs to be eliminated. But, oh, why is my thing not working? Wow.
The whole thing, or is it on a clicker?
No, it's on. I'm sorry about this. Doesn't happen before. No, it's not mine. Try this again. Okay, I think we're almost there. There we go. Okay. So we often think in terms of gridlock as something very bad, you know, where the parties are butting heads and they're at loggerheads and nothing's getting done. But what I hope to convey to you today, that gridlock in Washington is not always a bad thing. That when the parties actually are at odds and the people don't agree with each other, it's unsurprising that nothing gets done. And in many respects, gridlock is a good thing. It's a reflection that our system is working and that laws that perhaps shouldn't be passed aren't being passed. So let's talk about the president's powers with respect to a recent Supreme Court case called National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning. Okay? So this case involved the NLRB, which is a very powerful labor board. They make union policy, labor policy. The board has 5 members, okay? And at any given time, there can be 5 seats that are filled. If for whatever reason the board falls below 3 members, they lose their quorum. And if they lose their quorum, they can't make any decisions about labor policy. So during the last Bush administration, there was actually a policy by the Democrats to effectively filibuster any nominees to the National Labor Relations Board. And the goal of doing this was to drop them down below 3 members. And this happened. At one point, they actually had 2 members, and you can see them standing in this hallway. They look very lonely, right? Just the 2 of them. And the Supreme Court held that they cannot transact business with only 2 members of their board. Okay? So this was a type of gridlock we had years ago. And it continued into the Obama administration. So now that the president was a Democrat and the Senate was controlled by Democrats, the minority Republicans tried to filibuster all the nominees to the National Labor Relations Board to try and shut it down. So one of the nominees was this guy's name was Craig Becker, and he occasioned a very bitter fight. Why? He was a former head lawyer for the AFL-CIO and the SEIU. So effectively, the president was looking to put a union lawyer on the Labor Relations Board, and this would have been a very bad pick. So they basically filibustered him and would not give him an up or down vote. Okay, so at that point, the National Labor Relations Board was in jeopardy of losing its quorum. They were about to drop below 3 members. right? So what did the president do? Well, the Senate wouldn't vote on any of his nominees, so he turned to recess. He used the recess appointment power. So we all know that, generally speaking, when Congress is in town, they can do a lot of damage. This is actually my favorite Mark Twain quotes. No man's life, liberty, or property are safe when the legislature is in session. And perhaps not the Indiana legislature, but definitely the United States Congress, this applies. So the Constitution has a provision called the Recess Appointments Clause. And the purpose of this clause is to make sure that if Congress is out of town and a vacancy arises, the president can fill it. So if you imagine back in the early 1800s when someone died in Washington over the summer and everyone was back at their farms plowing and do whatever it is that farmers do, how can they possibly fill the vacancy? So they can't, because the Senate can't confirm that. So what happens? The president has the power to fill the vacancy himself, right? The president may fill any vacancy that may arise. So knowing that Obama could have filled this vacancy, the Republicans did something strategic. They did not let the Senate go into recess. They made sure that at least once every 3 days, the Senate held a session, however brief. And my friends, this was a very brief session. So the entire session of the Senate lasted roughly 45 seconds. A senator gavelled in. This is Mark Warner, Virginia. He said a few words, and then he gavelled out. That was the entirety of the session. And you see in this calendar that every 3 days, they did these four pro forma sessions. They had one on January 3rd and one on January 6th. So effectively, the Senate continued in session having these little pro forma sessions. So was there a vacancy? If you ask the Senate, the answer is no. There was no vacancy. If you ask President Obama, he'll say, yes, there was a vacancy. On the 4th of January, right after this short 60-second session, he made 3 recess appointments to the board. He basically filled up the board with 3 new appointees, giving him a 5-member quorum. So the question was, can the president decide when the Senate's in a vacancy? I'm sorry, can the president decide when the Senate's in a recess? Or can only the Senate decide when they're in a recess? If you ask the Senate, they said they were in session, and the president disagreed. So this issue went to the Supreme Court with the case of Noel Canning versus National Labor Relations Board. Noel Canning was a Pepsi bottler in Washington State, and they had an adverse judgment against him by the NLRB. So he decided to challenge that in court. The D.C. Circuit ruled in their favor. They said the president cannot make these recess appointments. So the case was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, where the president had to defend his recess appointments. What's remarkable at this case is that all 9 justices agreed that the president acted unconstitutionally. Unanimously, the court held that the recess appointments were void. The opinion, not by Justice Scalia, but by Justice Breyer, said the Senate decides when they're in session, not the president. Okay? And Breyer made the point very well. If the president could simply disregard what the Senate does, that gives the president way too much power, and we cannot have that. Okay? So all 9 justices rejected Obama's assertion that he can make these appointments. But I want to focus on one aspect of the opinion that perhaps hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, which is a role of intransigence, right? The reason why the president made these recess appointments was because the Senate wouldn't confirm his nominees. Had the Senate confirmed his nominees, he would not have needed to work around them. Justice Kagan made the very fine point, which said, listen, the recess appointment clause was designed to deal with congressional absence, right, when the Senate's out of town. But you're using it to deal with congressional intransigence, right? When the Congress is butting heads with the president kind of sidestepped them. Don Verrilli, who is a Solicitor General, the top lawyer for the government, made a remarkable statement. He said, quote, "The recess power acts as a safety valve given that intransigence." In other words, when Congress gets all pressured up, the president can just release some steam by working around the Constitution, by just twisting the meaning of the recess appointment clause, right? My friends, the Constitution is not a teapot, right? You cannot just tip it over and pour out the steam. These are checks and balances designed to prevent the very type of lawlessness the president engaged in. It's the structural protections of our Constitution and not just individual rights that define our individual liberty. And one way that liberty is protected is by putting checks on what the president can do. And he cannot put people into offices on a whim. He can only do it when the Senate is in a recess. So Justice Alito made the point very well. He said, listen, this is a very aggressive argument in favor of executive power. Chief Justice Roberts made the same point. The Senate has an absolute right not to confirm your nominees. So the mere fact that the Republicans are voting down Obama's nominees or not voting at all doesn't give the president extra power. I'll know the special irony. Barack Obama holds a distinction of voting against this guy and this guy. He voted against both presidential appointees of George W. Bush. So that's a nice history. Right? But even more so, right? Washington now is beset with gridlock. What is the relationship between gridlock and executive power? On this point, Justices Scalia and Breyer, who are very good friends, do not agree. So Breyer made the point, which I think we could all agree with, right? When the Congress is gridlocked, this is not some sort of constitutional problem. This is a political problem. How can the president get around this gridlock? Well, maybe appoint someone who's not a union lawyer. Maybe have a package where I'll give the Republicans this and they give me that. This is generally how things work. There are political ways of resolving this issue without resorting to these extra constitutional means, right? What can the president do? He has his bully pulpit, right? He can stand up and use his power of the presidency to try to influence opinion and thought. But instead of using the bully pulpit, the president uses his pen and his phone. Yes, we've heard him say this many times. The president says very clearly, I have my pen and I have my phone, and you know what? I don't need Congress. This is a very dangerous approach to constitutional law and a very dangerous approach to the presidency. The president said very clearly, I take executive action when we have a serious problem and Congress chooses to do nothing. I'm going to push back against this forcefully, right? When Congress votes no on something, they're not doing nothing. They're doing something. When Congress votes no, they made a decision not to implement the president's agenda. And that's an important decision, right? Gridlock is not some sort of mystical thing. Gridlock is a product when the president and Congress do not agree. And there's not a middle ground because both parties are so far apart. Justice Scalia, I think, stated it well. Gridlock is not a bug to be fixed. It's a calculated feature of our constitutional framework. Our Constitution was designed to create this gridlock and prevent one party or one branch from working in the absence of the other branch. Okay? So what about the argument, well, wait a minute, doesn't Congress have a duty to make laws and pass laws? No, they have no such duty. We know in the Constitution the president has the duty to take care of the laws of faithfully executed. He shall do so. Does Congress have any duty to pass laws? None. Ever remember Schoolhouse Rocks? Remember the little Bill trying to become a law and he couldn't? He was so sad. He was crying on the steps of Capitol Hill because he didn't become a law. It's hard to make a bill become a law, and there's no obligation for Congress to do so. Okay? Another mantra of the presidency is we can't wait. We can't afford to wait for Congress. I'm going to go ahead without them. He actually made this context in the arena of immigration, but as it turns out, he can wait. It now seems that we'll get our immigration, whatever he's going to give, after the election when he's no longer accountable. But apparently, back then he said we couldn't wait. And he's made this his platform. We can't wait. We can't wait. You can buy Barack Obama "We Can't Wait" buttons online if you want. We can't wait. He has an entire section of his website explaining why we can't wait. Patience is a virtue. Our constitutional system is not premised on speed. It's premised on deliberation, where only the best bills, which have the most consensus, make it through the process. Okay? In the absence of agreement, you maintain the status quo. You keep calm and carry on. Okay? The president's also explained, right? Look, as long as they insist on obstruction, I'll keep taking action on my own. And again, this is viewing obstruction as some sort of evil thing when it isn't. Obstruction is the party in Congress saying, we don't want this agenda, so we're going to vote no, right? I don't see how there's much of a difference between obstruction and merely voicing opposition. Obstruction sounds so much worse, right? But the mere fact that Congress says no, and we do live in a very polarized society, shouldn't be surprising. But that doesn't give the president a license to go beyond his executive power delegated to him in the Constitution. All right. So how do we think of the president's power to act? Well, we have to go back to the seminal case, which I'm sure all of you studied, Youngstown Street and v. Sawyer, right? This is the canonical case we study for executive power. So what happened? You had a steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio, not too far from here, well, a couple states away, right? And the steel mill was about to go on strike. The workers were about to go on strike. The president feared that if this steel mill goes on strike, there would not be enough steel to supply the war effort in Korea. This was during the height of the Korean War. So what did the president do? Well, he decided to seize all the steel mills. He basically put them under federal control. I don't know if you actually study what that means, but when a steel mill is under federal control and you try and go on strike, you get arrested, right? They throw you in a military jail. So that's a very good incentive not to go on strike. Okay, so effectively, all the steel mills were seized. They challenged it in court. In probably one of the most important separation of power decisions of all time, the Supreme Court said to the president, no, you cannot take these steel mills, right? Why can you not take these steel mills? Because you as the president do not have this power to do so. The president only has that authority which is given to him by the Constitution or by Congress. The Constitution does not give the president the power to seize property. Congress has that power. What we remember most about the Youngstown opinion is the concurring statement by Justice Robert Jackson, one of the greats. And Justice Jackson said, here's how we have to understand, executive power. There are these different tiers, right? So at the very top, right, when Congress says, yes, Mr. President, you can do it, and the president says, okay, I'll do it. When they both agree, the president has strongest power to do just about everything. And then at the bottom, where the president says, can I have this power, Congress? And the Congress says, no, you cannot. That's when the president's at his lowest ebb. And then in the middle, right, there's this murky a zone of twilight, this twilight zone, where Congress wants to do something, the president wants to do something, but it's not really clear whether they agree or disagree. In this case, Justice Jackson found that the president was acting at his lowest ebb, right? Why was he acting at his lowest ebb? Because Congress had specifically declined to give the president the power to seize property. Congress had considered it, and they said, no, we do not want this. So here, the president said, I want to do something, and Congress said to him, no, you cannot do this. So the court found that it was unconstitutional. So he was at his lowest ebb. All right, so let's consider a few contemporary issues in the context of the Youngstown framework. So one issue involves, of course, Obamacare. And I don't know, has anyone in this room ever had their health insurance plan canceled or deal with that? Varies by state. Some states, a lot of hands go up. Interesting, Indiana didn't. Well, when Obamacare was being sold, one of the biggest promises was, if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep your health insurance plan. And this was repeated over and over and over again by every single person who supported the law. It was a lie. It was an absolute abject lie. And this is not Josh saying this, right? This is PolitiFact, which voted the lie of the year. It was such a big lie because the way Obamacare works is by taking people off their inexpensive plans and putting them onto these more expensive and comprehensive Obamacare plans. That's how it works, right? There's no mystery. In fact, leading up to all these cancellations, the president made it even harder to renew your old plans. But suddenly, it became unpopular. And all these people started complaining, right? Saying, I like my plan. I want to be able to keep it. And all these plans were getting canceled, right? By the way, the reason why we have an election next week and you're not seeing any cancellations is basically the process was delayed till after November. So, we can, of course, this is how these things work, right? So in a sharp reversal, the president changed the policy. He said, listen, you can grandfather all of your old plans, right? You can take all of your old plans and keep them. The problem with this is that they were void under federal law. The law made it very clear that these old plans were not valid, and they would subject you to the individual mandated penalty, right? Obama said, that's okay, I just want to enforce the law. I won't actually collect the penalty. You guys can have these old plans, no big deal. Oh, and by the way, state insurance commissioners, you're now having the option where you can choose to accept these old plans or not. But make it clear, it's not my fault. If you don't do it, it's the state's fault, or it's the insurance company's fault. So the president basically passed the buck to the states, passed the buck to the insurance company, and said, hey, with like 3 weeks notice, how about you uncancel millions of plans and make them work, okay? Can the president do this? No. The president can't simply rewrite the law. He cannot simply say, oh yeah, we're going to take these plans which are void and treat them as if they're valid. This is a big no-no. What makes it even more remarkable is a bill actually passed the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis, right? What would this bill have done? This bill would have allowed people to keep their old plans. Okay, it would allow people to keep their own plans. This bill is headed to the Senate, and what did the president say? He didn't say, okay, sure, I'll sign it. He said, you know what, I'm going to veto this bill. The president was going to veto the exact bill which would accomplish what he tried to accomplish. Congress was trying to fix the law that he passed, and he said he was going to veto that bill. Right? He also saved people in the Senate by having to just do it himself, and that mooted the entire issue. I submit, in this case, the president's acting as lowest ebb. There's really no authority for him to claim that he can ungrandfather these plans and allow states to do this, right? This is something for Congress to do. Congress can pass a law saying, here are the plans that are valid, not the president. Okay? Let's talk about the Obamacare employer mandate. Right, so one of the provisions of Obamacare is that all businesses with more than 50 employees are required to provide health insurance to their workers. Right, as you might imagine, this is very expensive and not very popular. So it became known that basically businesses didn't want to do this, and this is a very unpopular aspect of the law. In addition to the website, of course. So what did the president do? Can we fix it? Yes, we can. He decided, you know what? I'm just going to delay the employer mandate, right? The thing that's effectively the heart of how a lot of Obamacare works, he just kicked down the road. He let all these companies get out of Obamacare free. And he didn't delay it once, he delayed it twice. First till 2014, and then through 2016. So now this won't kick into almost the next presidential election. It'll be someone else's problem, right? Not my problem. Since I'm sensing a pattern here, right? In each case, the president doesn't have the authority to simply delay the implementation of a law like this, right? Congress says this shall go into effect on a certain date. Shall means must. And this is a very important aspect of the law. The president preemptively just delayed it. Now, there are lots of other aspects of the law that didn't actually work well, the website or other stuff. That launched on the first day miserably. But one of the key portions, he delayed. He delayed the individual mandate a year. He delayed the employer mandate a year. Again, he's acting as lowest ebb. Okay. Let's talk about immigration for a minute, okay? You may remember there was a proposed law called the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act would have given a path to citizenship and status for the Dreamers. These are people who came here without authorization and when they were minors. And there are all these movements to pass the DREAM Act. By the way, in case you're not playing Where's Waldo, there's Che Guevara right up there. I always have to point them out in all my presentations, right? So this bill became very controversial. And it almost passed the Senate. It got 59 votes in the Senate, 1 vote shy of cloture. Okay, so the DREAM Act was defeated. So what did the president do? Did he call it quits? Did he try another bill? No, he kind of did it himself. So through a policy called DACA, right, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the president effectively gave a lot of the relief that would be accomplished through the DREAM Act. He gave a temporary legal status to the Dreamers. He said effectively, I'm not going to deport any of you, so don't worry about it. And oh, by the way, here's some work permits. Right? He said it. I will fix the immigration system on my own without Congress. Well, unfortunately, Congress is the one who defines immigration systems. The president does have discretion to deport or not to deport. But here he selected an entire class of people, almost 500,000 people, and said, we will not prosecute you. We will not apply the immigration laws to you. This is a decision for Congress to make. In fact, it was a decision that Congress was asked to make, and they said no to. So when Congress says no to something, the president decides to do it anyway. This is very problematic. Again, acting at his lowest ebb. Okay, let's talk about Libya for a moment. Right? Everyone remember the problem with Libya? This is back on better terms. But they were having a civil war. And for reasons I'm still not quite sure, the United States decided to intervene. And we engaged in serious bombings using planes and drones and other weapons of destruction. We decided to just bomb the blitz out of Libya. Did the president ask for Congress's permission first? No, he didn't. Okay? So generally speaking, the president has the power, the War Powers Act, to engage in hostilities against a foreign country, and he can do so for up to 60 days. He can go and bomb another country up to 60 days. After the 60 days is up, he needs to ask for Congress's permission. And at that point, Congress needs to give him authority. So we're bombing Libya, bombing Libya, bombing Libya. We're running up to the 60-day window. Did the president bother going to Congress to ask for an authorization? No. Why? Because they all said no. They all said, we don't know why we're there. Pull out now. Right? By the way, Libya has been really good to us since. But you know, they all said, scram. So what did the president do? Well, he went to his Department of Justice, his Office of Legal Counsel, and he asked for an opinion saying, hey, can I keep bombing Libya after 60 days? They said, no, you cannot. So then he went to his Department of Defense, General Counsel, and said, hey, guys, can I keep bombing them after 60 days? And they said, no, that's illegal. So he chose door number 3, a guy named Harold Coe, who was a former dean of Yale Law School and was working at the State Department as a legal advisor. And he went to Harold Coe. Hey, Harold, can I keep bombing Libya after 60 days? Mind you, DOJ said no. DOD said no. He said yes. Okay, so how did they figure out a way to keep bombing Libya after 60 days? Well, the War Powers Act says hostilities must end within 60 days, right? Okay. So what did Harold Coe say? Bombing Libya is not hostilities. That our actions in Libya are not hostilities that can be destroyed. So effectively, because we're not engaging in hostilities, we're not bound by the War Powers Act. So effectively, the president was able to sidestep the War Powers Act by saying that bombing a country is not hostilities. If any of you would put that on your exam, you would fail. This is not a very good answer. Bombing a country is hostilities. There's not much of a doubt about that. And it requires a severe perversion of the rule of law to actually make the argument that bombing is not hostilities. Again, the president's at his lowest ebb. He does not have much of a footing to stand on, right? All right, let's talk about Bergdahl for a second. I remember him. Suddenly, without any notice, the president announced in the Rose Garden that Bo Bergdahl, who was a prisoner of war held in Afghanistan for a number of years, had been released, right? So at first we're like, yay, great, we got him back. But then we figured out how they got him back, okay? How did they get him back? By releasing 5 of the most dangerous people at Guantanamo Bay. These are the detainees. These were very high-value targets, right? There are some people at Guantanamo that people admit are not very dangerous and they can be released. These are not them. These are very, very significant people. So what did the president do? He engaged in a prisoner swap. He exchanged these 5 guys for Bergdahl. But there was a problem. Congress had passed a statute requiring the president to give 30 days notice before releasing these 5 guys. Did the president give 30 days notice? No. He barely gave 1 day's notice to some people, and they gave it to everyone. So there was a serious blowback against the president as a result of this, right? The thing blew up in his face. And unlike most problems, it wasn't just a Republican problem. This was bipartisan. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, no right-winger, said that the House and the Senate were unanimously opposed to this. They did not want to release these 5 guys for Bergdahl. So put this in your heads. When Congress passed a statute requiring 30 days notice, they passed it with this background. They passed it with the understanding that we don't want the president to release these 5 guys. In fact, there are only actually 7 people in Guantanamo who are so dangerous. This was the only major trade they were talking about. And Congress said, we do not want you releasing this without our notice. The president did it anyway. Can he do this? Well, initially, Chuck Hagel, who's the Secretary of Defense, said, you know what? The president can do this under Article 2 of the Constitution, right? The commander-in-chief power. This is a John Yoo argument. It's almost a unitary executive argument. And they quickly retreated from this because they don't like talking about the Constitution. So instead they said, you know what? We didn't think Congress would have wanted the statute to apply under these circumstances, right? The president said, we didn't think Congress would have actually wanted to stop us from releasing Bergdahl for these 5 guys. When the very statute was passed against the background of these 5 guys for Bergdahl, this trade had been discussed for years. So it's almost fictional. You have to be in a state like Wonderland to assume that Congress would have actually favored this trade when they said we do not want to do this, right? Again, the president's acting at his lowest ebb, where Congress says no and he does it anyway. Okay, let's turn to our most recent example, right? ISIS. ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or just Islamic State, or the group formerly known as ISIS, whatever you want to call them, right? ISIS is a very bad group. They are trying to establish an Islamic caliphate in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, and they are doing some really horrible things. They are beheading journalists. By the way, if you want to get the world to turn against you, mess with journalists. That's how you really get public attention against you, okay? Christian missionaries don't really count, but if you behead journalists, that's when you really get in trouble, okay? So it turns out that the group that was once called a junior varsity, Al-Qaeda, is now actually Al-Qaeda. So about a month, actually about 2 months ago now, the United States announced that we will be going to war with ISIS. So the president asked for Congress's permission. Well, if you're sensing a pattern, the answer to that question is no, of course he didn't ask for the president's permission. Yeah, but that's not his style. He said instead, I already have all the authority I need. Okay? So what could conceivably be the authority for the United States to go to war with ISIS? Okay. So first we have the 2001 authorization for use of military force against Al-Qaeda. So after 9/11 happened, President Bush went to Congress and got an authorization to basically destroy Al-Qaeda or anyone who is affiliated with Al-Qaeda or anyone who supports them. So far, so good, right? So we've been fighting Al-Qaeda outside of Afghanistan. We're fighting them in Yemen and the Saudi Peninsula, wherever. But there's a problem by calling ISIS Al-Qaeda. What's the problem? They don't like each other very much. In fact, Al-Qaeda actually expelled ISIS because they're too crazy. I know you don't think about this, but Al-Qaeda said ISIS are nuts and we don't want to deal with them. So how in the world can it be that ISIS is also Al-Qaeda? So what did the president say? Ready for this? ISIS is the true inheritor of Osama bin Laden's legacy. In fact, when bin Laden died, ISIS is actually now the real Al-Qaeda, and the real Al-Qaeda is fake Al-Qaeda. This is the argument, that actually this group, the one beheading journalists, is the real Al-Qaeda, therefore have the authority to go after them. So I'll give a partial defense, which is probably better than I should. The statute says the president gets to determine who Al-Qaeda is. So the president here is determining that ISIS is actually Al-Qaeda. What about actual Al-Qaeda? We're still bombing them. Well, I guess they're Al-Qaeda also. It's like, Oprah, you're Al-Qaeda, and you're Al-Qaeda, and you're Al-Qaeda, right? If everyone's Al-Qaeda, then the president has a blank check to bomb any brown country. And I'm not being too extreme there, but this is a very broad authority. An authority that I should add that President Obama wanted to repeal. Not 6 months ago, the president said we need to get rid of this 2001 AUMF. It's too broad. So the very authority Obama wanted to appeal, he's now using in a really broad manner to go after all these groups. Nobel Prize winner and all. I think he has some explaining to do. Okay. The second ground of authority. The second authority for the ISIS incursion is the 2002 authorization for use of military force against Iraq. Again, President Bush went to Congress and got this before we toppled Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. If you remember the last Iraq war, we've had now 4 consecutive Iraq wars. 4 consecutive presidents have taken us to war in Iraq. I guess it's a presidential thing at this point, right? So does the 2002 AUMF against Iraq work? Well, there's a problem here. So a very, very prominent constitutional law professor told us about 2 years ago that the war in Iraq is over. Okay, his name was Barack Obama. Barack Obama declared victory. He said the war in Iraq is over. We're going to bring back our troops. This is done. My friends, if the war in Iraq is over, how in the world are we back at war against Iraq, which is actually also in Syria, but not the Iraqi government? right? We declared victory in that war. That war is over. How did that war get rekindled against a totally different group in a different country? Again, this is a case where the president should go to Congress, and it's very likely that after the election he will. I don't think he wanted a defeat for the Democrats before Congress, but we'll see what happens there. So again, lowest ebb, right? The president's acting on these really tenuous, weak statutory interpretation arguments. All right, I want to close by talking about non-enforcement. President Obama's primary method of getting around Congress has been not enforcing the law. Actually, I had a cover article in National Review right last month. If you look very closely, you can see he's erasing the take care clause. So he shall take care of the laws if faithfully executed. So he's erasing that. I think in many respects, the president has looked to not enforcing the law as a way to break the gridlock, right, as a way to get around the gridlock. So I want to give you a couple hypotheticals of what different presidents can